I'm going to talk about some things and some things we should maybe keep in mind as we talk about what does identity mean, what are the various things involved with that. But I'm not trying to say don't do open. Open rocks, let's just get that out of the way, love open. But let's keep some things in mind. So what is identity? I'm not meaning things like authentication or authorization or single sign-on, any of that stuff. I'm talking about, well, first up, who defines what somebody's identity is? Is it an institutional thing? Is it an individual thing? We talked yesterday about guilds, no, this morning about guilds and organizations, that sort of thing. So how do things like formal and informal organizations impact somebody's sense of identity? Who owns it? Who gets to control what people say about what makes me me? And do I get to make assertions? Do other people make assertions? Now, what's your identity? A lot of people, I didn't until I started doing this presentation, putting it together. I didn't really think about my identity. I sort of, you take it for granted. I'm me and I do a bunch of stuff. But no, really, just take a couple seconds and think, if you were to describe yourself to somebody else in less than 140 characters maybe, who are you? So just, yeah, take a second, it's okay. Yeah, put it on Twitter right now. I'll give you a 130 character hashtag, so it's okay. But who am I? I mean, if we're talking about identity, is it just a bunch of attributes, things that describe bits of me? If it is, my identity would probably look stuff like this. I am a father, a husband, I went to high school at Bishop Grandin, I'm an employee, student, blah, blah, blah. My attributes would also be a bunch of other stuff, things that I do, things that I'm interested in, things that I've done in the past, things that I plan to do in the future. Things that may or may not belong in an institutional LDAP directory, things that wouldn't be on a business card. Whoa, feedback, that's surreal. I guess I'm projecting right into the internet. And this comes back again to who gets to own, who gets to decide what my identity is. Or is identity a product of activity, the things that you do? In which case, this could be considered part of my identity. The people that I know, the blogs that I read, the communities that I'm a part of. This is actually a diagram I made a long time ago. I even forget the software that I used. Okay, bad attribution. It was a Java app. You give it a URL, and it figures out what communities you're on online. This little thing in the middle is me, and it links out to things like EdTech Post and a bunch of other communities, and down to OL Daily and a bunch of others. So it's a good way to see at a glance, so where do you fit in with things? This I would consider part of my online identity. This is where I fit in the larger picture. This is actually my Facebook account, somewhere in there, and it shows connections between people. This is a pretty strong indication of what my online identity is. Again, this does not belong in the University of Calgary identity. This is not the traditional sense of identity, but just in my going about my daily life, interacting with the people that I interact with in the ways that I interact with, my identity forms this, and as well, so does theirs. Now, if we're talking about online identity or digital identity, what's the one place people go to see what their digital identity is? They don't go to LinkedIn or whatever. They go to Google. You Google yourself. So if I look at my digital identity and type my name in there, I get a bunch of stuff. Some of the stuff is me. I get to control what it is. But down towards the bottom of the page, some of the stuff is things that other people are saying. So although I am, in a sense, in control of maybe the top of those, just because I've been blogging forever, and have said enough controversial things that people have linked to me and that kind of stuff. But there are also things in here that other people are saying about me that I have no control over. Now, if we're talking about education, one of the big things from my point of view about education, about teaching, about learning in the classroom is providing a safe place. In this case, this was actually a Project Opus lunch I got to tag along with a couple of years ago now. This is a workplace. This isn't an institution of learning, but it is. At lunch, every Friday, these guys hang around and they teach each other stuff. That's a pretty cool, and it felt like a safe place to share. This was actually at a workshop I gave with some high-level CTOs of some of the largest companies in Canada. They provided these. The butcher paper all over the tables and crayons. So these guys in like $5,000 suits are in this safe place coloring all over the tables, doing Venn diagrams and all this kind of stuff. Providing a safe place gives people a way to create, and they create together. This was actually Northern Voice this year. Safe place is very important, especially for education. What's one of the biggest jobs of a student or a kid is to figure out who they are. How do they fit in? What are the people that they're like? Who are they not like? Who do they want to be when they grow up? So we need to provide a safe place for them to explore without serious repercussions. They need to be able to try on different personas, to be different people, to start to perform, to take on roles, and to take risks, even if the risk is just perceived. We're providing a safe place to take little risks. That's actually my son. That's him again. To begin to perform. This is actually the kids' science museum in Calgary. And so giving these kids a safe place to perform and start to find their voice is a very important thing. And then you can start increasing the scale. You don't start with something like this. You start on the empty stage, and then you move up to the Christmas concert. And then you move towards something like this. Now, one of the examples I've been talking about at the University of Calgary, I've installed a wiki. I don't run a wiki, it runs itself. One of our computer science profs said, hey, that's kind of cool. Let's put all the course content in there, and let's have our students actually do their term papers in it. So they divided into groups, and their term papers were collaboratively written on this wiki. You might notice there's a number here. This page has been accessed over 91,000 times, this student term paper. It was picked up by dig.com. It was linked by a bunch of people. Now, what does that mean? Okay, these students have their names on this. They had to put their full names and email addresses on as part of the assignment. But now, if you Google one of the students, before this assignment, she really didn't exist online. But now, this number one thing, the only real piece of content the student has produced, a potential employer might see, is this assignment. Now, that kind of makes me think a little bit. If this student essentially didn't exist before we gave the assignment, what is our role as the teacher in providing the assignments? In the nature of the assignment, in what kind of things they're doing, in what the topics are. Excuse me. And in even how it's assessed. If this potential employer for this person Googles Sarah Nickel Calgary and finds out, here's the term paper and the assessment's on what a piece of crap this is, blah, 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 that could be a kind of a negative impact on the student for their identity. There's also no validation on these links. That particular article was picked up by a website called Tech Life Post, and they call it a group of University of Calgary researchers. So these computer science undergrads doing a 200-level course are all of a sudden, they're the University of Calgary researchers. So, I mean, are they? I don't know. I guess in a sense they are. There's also a large aspect of privacy. You're in a classroom, it's a safe place, it's got a door on it. The door is to keep things safe. It's to keep, not necessarily to keep bad people out, but it's to keep the conversation within the sense of the class as a comfortable place. If this door was open and there was people constantly streaming in, yes, we could still be having this session. It wouldn't be as comfortable. I mean, you've got these nice chairs and that kind of thing. It's not too loud in here. Having doors is actually a good thing. It provides the safe place. It provides private property. This is actually, I took this picture, again, on a bike ride. Most of my pictures are taken on a bike ride. Going past this really insanely rich golf course on my way to work. And right after you get past the golf course with the Bentleys and all this stuff, somebody on the front lawn stuck this, private property. But private property isn't bad. I mean, you don't want people going through your fridge and taking your lunch and that kind of stuff. So having private property is good. Having a door in your classroom can be a good thing because it keeps the things that you're doing outside of the larger eye until you're ready. Things like a report card. People do get report cards, as much as we rail against assessment here. At the end, people are expecting to either pass or fail grade 7 or whatever it is, and the way you do that is getting a report card. Traditionally, you get your report card, you take it home, it's on the fridge for a week, and it's forgotten. Now your report card's archived by the Internet Archive if you're doing things in the public, if you're doing things completely open. There are implications for putting everything online. Putting everything online can also affect how you behave. You can generate a culture of surveillance. Everybody's watching each other. It becomes, you know, what's Jim doing? Oh, I don't know. What's he writing at 3 a.m. on Spider-Man, that kind of thing. Which, he writes some kind of strange things at 3 a.m. But in our role as non-students, well, actually I'm a student again, but our role as sort of educational technologists, to quote a certain publication, our our role is not to, we're not doing this as students. We're not being compelled to do these activities. So if we choose to do these things online, this sort of culture of surveillance may not be there because they're opt-in activities as opposed to something where if we're having a student do it as part of a course, they can't opt out unless they drop the course. There's sort of that going in. I was actually researching a previous presentation and came across this picture. Jeremy Bentham designed the perfect prison, industrial age prison. And basically what it was this big building where there were optical pipes everywhere. So you're in your cell and you had the perception of being watched. Now, we don't want this online, open all the time stuff to sort of get the feeling of you're being watched all the time, so you must behave. I forget where I was going with that. But I just love this diagram. It's just so cool. So we want to avoid that kind of feeling of being constantly watched, and that we are watching. Recently, actually, Andre Milan posted this thing about training wheels. Using a CMS is like training wheels. We're training people to ride a bike on a training wheel, but you can't go faster than 10 kilometers an hour, and if you turn too fast, you're going to flip over. So training wheels are good to a point. But at some point, you've got to get out of the training wheels. And initially, I actually completely agree with that. But then I started thinking a little bit more, and well, training wheels, what are we training these students for? If we're talking about training wheels as it pertains to openness and putting everything you have online so that your assessment is on there, all your term papers is on there, what are we training? Are we training them to publish content? Are we training them to engage as part of a community? Are we training them to be participants in this thing? And that's just something we need to keep in mind. When we're having people do these things with the training wheels of the CMS or the closed blog site or whatever, what are we actually training them to do? And are we training them to do? Ideally, this stuff should be internally motivated. The students are choosing to publish content or not publish content. What about our students? The blogging service at University of Calgary, when a student comes to the blog, they can sign up for any number of sites they want. They get a form that says this: give us the domain, so my super fantastic blog, the blog title, whatever you want it to call. But it's got a checkbox. Do you want this site to be private, yes or no? And the default right now is yes, I would like it to be private. Why is that? Well, it's very easy to uncheck this checkbox or to toggle it. But most of the sites that we're finding, our active communities at the Calgary blog site, are actually what would be considered closed or walled gardens. The biggest example was a political science prof, Dr. Rainer Knopf, who has, it's about 30 students. It's not a huge class, but they're senior undergrads and grads. It's a hybrid course. And it's one of the most active blogging communities. It's closed to the public. But because the students are taking advantage of the same software as being in the open, they're having the ability to publish content, link and comment and all that kind of thing. They have this amazingly active community. It really is a full-on community. It's not just a bunch of people in a course on a discussion board. You go onto this site, and I can't show you because of ethical clearance and all that stuff, but it does feel tangibly like a community. You can see the links and who's writing on various topics and that kind of thing. But giving the class this option, and the students, if they create their own sites, they have the option as well. And so giving this, realizing that the individual is in control of this thing is a very powerful part of this whole sort of identity thing. We're not giving them their space. They have the space. They get to decide how it's used. So what should be open? I don't know, do we really need all the term papers online? Polluting, if you Google Darcy Norman, do I really want to see my qualitative research methods term paper that I just handed in? Not really, it was kind of crap, but it got an A, which might be another issue. So having everything up there is maybe not such a great thing. Do we want all class or group discussions to be online and open? I think there's a very strong argument to say yes, we want some of that. There's an equally strong argument to say not every class or group discussion needs to be open because of the whole implication of permanent archive and that kind of thing. Again, back to this poli-sci prof, Dr. Knopf decided explicitly to have his site closed because as a poli-sci prof, his students were 10 or 20 years from now going to be running for office, some of them. And does he want the Globe and Mail reporter 20 years from now to Google to see somebody's controversial stance when they were an undergrad on abortion or Senate reform or any of these things? Can we make people publish this stuff online without them being fully aware of how it's going to be used 10, 20 years down the road. Permanent is permanent, and once it's out there, there's no real way to effectively take it back. And so, I mean, with great power comes great responsibility. Nobody's jumping up, interjecting, so either I've talked way too fast, I've rambled, or surely somebody must disagree with something. Jim, I know you do.
Well, no, I don't disagree with your being. I'm interested in this idea of the identity and the digital identity you're talking about, and the way in which you manage it. But I mean, part of it was thinking about spaces like this as a way to kind of frame what that means.
Yeah.
And it's kind of open that up to kind of, I mean, and it's where you kind of see the idea of take your own space, map your own, whatever, however you want to look at it,
Yep.
the PLE model. Of this is something that you're going to have to deal with. It's going to be open and out there. So why not take control and think about that as an individual on some other level? And part of that being a process that's thought about, you know, intelligently in a whether in the university. And I think, I mean, that's kind of where you're going with this. But I'm wondering why so much you're pushing towards is we got to kind of remember the be careful.
I'm
wondering why that pose.
You mean as opposed to not being careful?
As opposed to that part of the learning is going to involve risk.
Yeah, but I think when you take a risk, there needs to be a sense of like disclosure. What are the risks? And as a student comes into a course, I mean, they might not know all of the risks. Students we know are naive. They put the drunken photos on Facebook. They do all this stuff. So they might willingly post something controversial. And yes, it might be a teaching moment, but again, this is permanent. Teaching moment might poison their career. And there's hands everywhere. Sorry, Alec was.
Yeah, I think I'm finding it less careful, more deliberate,
Yeah.
and of course educated around that.
Mindful.
The piece around drunken photos on Facebook, for instance. Like I work with teacher education students, and they're actually upheld to a higher ethical standard as teachers because they can't do certain things with students in public.
Yep.
Even sitting at a restaurant together, or
Yep.
at the same restaurant, at the table beside each other, that sort of thing. So we have to deal with those things. So letting those students know what their professional obligations and what sort of things should be online. That's why I think it's deliberate. I'm also coming to that. I've taught two of these totally open courses, and the first one went really well in terms of how students, put themselves out online, and they felt good about it. The second one I came up was a totally different culture. It was a First Nations group, and the cultural sensitivities that I didn't even think about coming up to this particular group. And this group was a northern Saskatchewan group, and they had certain ways of looking at privacy. What's different than my own? So I think that's very important.
So there's the cultural, and there's also the age. Would it be different if you're doing K-12 versus higher education? And there's different rights and responsibilities. I think Cole was next, and then Alan.
Well, so this idea of digital literacy is interwoven in this thing. And I really think that one of the things that we have to be doing, starting at a very early age, and I work with K-12 teachers as well in the state of Pennsylvania, which is in the United States. But starting literally at kindergarten and first grade, the idea is that what we're promoting is that students, children, have both private and public places to do ongoing reflection. So that they can actually come back and see their chemistry paper, right, from 7th or 8th grade. And that's an important thing, I think, long term, because I think eventually that is part of this whole notion of identity, but it's that digital literacy piece that they understand that, no, this is private.
Yeah.
But it's my private, it's not Facebook private. Because Facebook private means it sits on some boxes somewhere in, Northern California that you never get in or get out of. And so the idea of my private, I think, is really important. But understanding when to do, basically what you're talking about.
Well, the fact that they can get their grade 7 paper, but I can't get their grade 7 paper is a very, very important thing.
But that they might be able to do some meta reflection upon that paper.
Absolutely.
Without exposing that paper.
And these blogging communities that I was showing there, even though they are sort of walled gardens, they still have the export blog. They still have the take my stuff and go home option as well.
So there are practical and ethical issues here that I think start where you are and go beyond this. I teach a class at U of T on online communities, and I've got a repository now of all the participation of all my students for the past few years. And this year we wanted to invite somebody into the class who was not a class member, a famous person in this area, and that changed the whole dynamic because the students all of a sudden realized it's not just now that my stuff has to be kept private, but it has to be stewarded and curated and basically maintained ad infinitum, onto, who knows when. because they have to trust me now to maintain next year's records and the year after and the year after and the year after until I retire, pretty much, and not let somebody come in 20 years from now. So
Yeah.
it isn't just a matter of my current safe place. It's 20 years from now, it's still going to be a safe place for where I was going back to search. So there's an ethical responsibility on the educator to commit to that. You're taking on more than you think when you start collecting all of your students' stuff.
Yeah.
And there's also the power imbalance thing. I mean, it isn't just about being careful. You have a power imbalance when you start your class, even if you try to get around it, where the students feel compelled to share, post 5 things in the chat room or whatever, because you told them to, even if you didn't necessarily tell them to.
Yeah.
So that's a major ethical thing.
Well, they need to impress teacher. Even if they don't need to. There is a feeling that they need to.
As Jim said, my name is Chung. I'm with Information Technologies at the University of Calgary. And what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, actually Jim covered quite well in his presentation last session, which is great because I actually learned quite a bit from him. But basically, title is Connecting Online Learning Through Identity. And basically, over the last couple of years, I've been trying to, ever since I joined IT, that is, I've been trying to gain a deeper understanding of educational technology, kind of beyond the level of the individual products like a wiki or a blog and so forth, and try to figure out what the underlying primitive elements at play are. And because understanding the basic reasons for kind of how software interact with each other and how things work the way they do, could allow us to help us make better choices about development and use of educational technologies. And more recently, I've come to realize that some of the reasons that we engage in PLEs and EduGlue and these other concepts, or EduPunk, is that they actually have a strong basis in sustainability. So I'm going to share with you some of the things I've discovered around that, and hopefully what they mean for various contexts. So, I'm going to make this talk I'm going to go through this talk by making 2 broad assertions. The first one is that open source is irrelevant, and the second one is IT doesn't matter. So let's dive into the first one. So we generally accept that open source is preferable to kind of closed source, or the opposite, whatever the opposite of open source is. And it's kind of like almost like a rite of passage that we use free and open source software when we go in to make our PLEs or in being an EduPunk or something. And open source is almost kind of like a feature point. It's one of those bullet points that you see always that people always point out when they're talking about a piece of software that is open source when that's the case. So, but kind of why does open source matter? And generally, I kind of picked out these 4 reasons. These are kind of the normal talking points that we might be familiar with. One is that it's free. The source code is available so that we can customize software to our needs or tinker around with how it works. Being open, there's a chance for collaborative development. So in addition to using software, you can contribute to its development and growth. And there's also a chance for community building. Just by being open, there's often a chance to connect with other people that are interested in the same areas of development and go along your ways. And perhaps generally there's also probably less risk from software being unavailable because of market changes. The publisher of some software disappears or licensing terms change or whatnot. Looking through some diagrams of PLEs that Scott Leslie has collected over, I'm not sure when this happened, a couple of years. And especially ones that contain references to specific pieces of software. So this one's from DArcy. And just looking at concentrating on the ones that actually point out pieces of software and looking at some of them, not a lot of those points actually are not open source software. And you may so by that I mean stuff like SlideShare or Facebook or YouTube. And you may be thinking that those examples like that are not really, they're services consumed over the web instead of being kind of like application software you install on your own servers or your own computers. But really that's just a difference in kind of the locality of the software, where it's on some distant server or here. Web delivered services can obviously just as easily be built from open source components, just as your local software could be closed source. So basically, I wouldn't expect anybody here to argue that services like Flickr or Google Docs or Twitter or YouTube are less valuable because they are closed source software, but because we kind of, I think, instinctively understand that the value or that they're valuable for reasons of easy access or usually low or zero cost. They often expose APIs so that other pieces of software can interface with them in different ways. So like Twitter, we have all sorts of different Twitter clients that interact with Twitter. And they often support easy ways to share stuff, so we can share stuff with other people and through that be able to connect with other people. So to me, that's those reasons are kind of closely resemble to some of those desirable attributes of open source. And so the theory is that the desire for open source tools, I think, has little to do with the fact that they're open source per se. And rather, it's kind of the ideology that's associated with open source software that we truly value. And this is kind of expressed in the ability to tinker with a piece of software and to influence or augment its behavior. The ability to connect disparate pieces of software, like in an edge glue or something, to make a greater whole. And the ability to access and manipulate data to derive greater meaning or greater value from them. And so those are properties that are not exclusive to open source software. And they're kind of equally possible with closed source software too. And so, so I think championing or kind of pushing open source as a metaphor for the qualities that we find desirable in educational tools actually does us a disservice because it kind of emphasizes products rather than kind of the abilities of those products. And the focus on products rather than the kind of the actions they allow us to perform or the capabilities they allow us to develop kind of limits how we can describe how kind of different things are connected and interrelated to each other. So it's kind of like a plant with kind of rhizomes shooting out everywhere, and the products are kind of like the little bits above the ground that we can see. There's little plants here and there, and so forth, and we kind of treat them as individual bits of plants. But below the surface, they're all connected and related to each other in various or complex ways. So what we need to do is find kind of the most basic elements that these services act on and that we care about. And I'm positing that the two fundamental elements are identity and data, the stuff above the line there. So basically, identities are nouns. They are people, they're objects, they're locations, they're groups, or basically anything that you can give a name to. And data are the artifacts associated with the identities, associated with or belonging to the identities. And then services, kind of below the line there, are things like the YouTubes and Flickrs, Lightroom or whatever software you use that allows us to create, replicate, or manipulate data, manipulate these kind of two fundamental entities of identity and data. So, so basically, immediately at this point, services become secondary, and maintaining and persisting identity and data themselves is primary here, because when it comes time to kind of post a photo over, when it comes to post a photo or to share them over the web, we can involve a service to help us accomplish that. So, for example, Flickr is able to do that today. It can help us share photos, and tomorrow there may be a different service, and services aren't here forever. And so basically, in fact, kind of the lifetime of services in helping us do stuff should be considered only as long as they are actively, as long as you are actively accomplishing some task. And otherwise, services can essentially disappear for all we care. I think as long as the data and the identity are long-lasting, that's all we really need to care about in this model. Whoops. So So basically, I kind of was at that point for well over a year, and I couldn't figure out for quite some time kind of what that meant. And I just kind of had a gut feeling that said, that was important. But recently I read this book called Design is the Problem, which kind of gave me a clue. And this book is essentially about the impact of design on the produced world in terms of usability, resources, understanding, and priorities. So overall, it's about sustainability. And one of the key messages in the book is to don't do things today that make tomorrow worse. So what does that mean? So basically, how does design and sustainability now relate to distilling educational software into kind of base components of identity, data, and then services? And just to put it really simply, I think it's a matter of looking at the life cycle of software products in their use and thinking about the inputs that go into them and the outputs that result from their use. So generally speaking, both the inputs to and outputs from kind of educational software are just forms of identities and data, just very generically speaking. And because resources are not consumed in the digital world as they are in the physical world, as we use stuff, we simply get more and more of this stuff over time. And so just kind of looking at it that way, we now have kind of a basic cycle to measure against which to measure the sustainability of kind of software systems, with which we can then adapt sustainability approaches like and just various ones like cradle-cradle or life cycle analysis or whatever to kind of understand and improve their sustainability. So what that means is that to improve the sustainability of products in their use, we first have to recognize identity as a distinct element by itself. So or that's not dependent on some application or service to exist. So I think this is really key because for example, at my home institution, we use Blackboard as our LMS, and we feed Blackboard data about all of our courses, and then Blackboard then generates a course, Blackboard course for each course, it's kind of generating the identity for that course within Blackboard, and then we feed it. And then users feed that with data about the course, with course outlines and all the activities like discussions and so forth in it. So the question is, what happens when the course goes poof, or like the course? What happens when Blackboard itself goes poof? If it gets turned off, or in the case of my institution, where our data centers are out of power, so once in a while, power goes out. In something like that would happen because the courses, the identity of the existence of those courses are within the software itself. They would essentially cease to exist along with the software because they're tied in with the applications themselves. And so it's important to be able to kind of express the identity of the course or of the people in it or whatever in a way that's independent of a particular piece of software. And that can be something as simple as simply a URL on the web, because it's kind of because a URL is kind of like a name for something on the web, and so once you have kind of that expression of a course or of a person, then they may in fact use Blackboard to actually go about their business of discussing stuff and posting course outlines, and that's perfectly fine. Because now we can make the association from the identity to say that, hey, they're discussing stuff in Blackboard and they're posting stuff in Flickr. And if those services were to disappear, well, that course, the existence of that course isn't going to disappear along with it. So second is to be highly cognizant of the data associated with identities. So let's say you use Google Docs to store and edit some documents. So right now, your data inside Google Docs is tied to an identity, usually in the form of an email address that you use to log in. Now, outside of Google Docs, given that same identity, so given that email address, can you kind of make the assertion that there is data within Google Docs kind of that's belongs to that identity, and how you would go about actually accessing that data. And so if you can't kind of easily describe that kind of relationship, and the service doesn't provide you with a mechanism to make that, to describe that, then basically you're kind of in the world of hurt when if the service were to disappear or no longer fulfills your needs. It's an issue of kind of access to the data that you're generating related to your identities, that you be able to get at the data, kind of get that data out of the service when you want it, so you can then use it with something else, or to do whatever you want to do with it. It's also has to do with that it's when your data is kind of locked up in some service, it's hard for you to kind of derive the maximum possible benefits from that data, because it's not accessible to you in any other way other than that within that service. So I didn't have an example prepared, but that chart, that some of those charts that DArcy was actually showing, was the different graphs of how the social network graphs, I can't remember what they're called. If that Java applet wasn't able to access the data from those various services about those things, then it's not possible for some third-party app to come in and create those graphs for you. Basically, it's kind of what trying to get at there. Anyway, so identity and data are essentially forms of sustainable resources in the digital world, without which the services that we use are meaningless. And our activities via the services that we do use affect their state by creating, replicating, or manipulating those resources. So if you remember back to the statement of don't do things today that make tomorrow worse. Well, basically, by looking at these identity and data as resources, we can evaluate whether or not the applications we use, the services we use, are sustainable by how they treat those two resources. Oh, yes. And I guess the other important point I want to make here was that to remember that identity and data are kind of the entities here that need sustaining, and not the services themselves, because one of the beauties of the modern kind of internet-connected world, computing world, is that there's almost assuredly more than one way to accomplish anything. And it's never been easier to get access to kind of multiple applications and services to accomplish your goals. So if some service is not going to play nicely with your identity and data, it's kind of just like an ugly smokestack in the middle of a sea of green, I guess, that we are fortunate enough to be in today. So anyways, back to those assertions. So the second one that I made was IT doesn't matter. So this is also the title of an article by Nicholas Carr back in like 04 or 03, in which IT is compared to much earlier technologies like railroads and electric power. And although they can be kind of competitive advantages for businesses to kind of develop those when they're for a brief period of time when they're kind of emerging technologies, they eventually become ubiquitous, and the cost of and their cost decreases as they become commodity inputs. So strategically speaking, they no longer matter. And for what Nicholas Carr talks about, I kind of completely agree. And in fact, this time last year, that was a topic of discussion internally at IT at my institution in a kind of leadership series led by our CIO. And at one point, after a discussion of what IT does for our institution, our CIO asked kind of half rhetorically, who still agreed with the statement, and I kind of was the only one that raised a hand, and I quickly pulled that hand because I was sitting beside my manager at the time, and anyways, I kind of lost my nerves at the time because it's not a popular stance. But really, does IT actually matter? And my simple answer really is no, and because just basing from my own institution, and I don't really need my institution's IT for anything I really do. You know, I don't need to go to them, really need to go to them for email or to serve a web page or to stream videos and create wikis and to blog and all of this other stuff. And in fact, it's, you know, often it's downright inconvenient to come to my own department to kind of do that stuff. And so I said that my simple answer is no, because it's a no to the kind of the priorities and the roles that IT, I think, generally sees themselves in for academic endeavors. And essentially, you're kind of responding to an outdated need, because in the past, you know, IT didn't not only took care of laying out infrastructure, but they also brought in the kind of the applications and services to use that infrastructure. So you know, so you'd have like computer labs with WordPerfect installed, and because you couldn't just hop on the web and, you know, go use Google Docs or download OpenOffice or something like that. And so the same goes for email, storage, and many other things. And to access these systems in the past, or even currently, you typically have an account, provide, you know, by IT of some sort, and that was kind of the extent of your identity. And as for data, you know, other than making sure that, you know, your floppy disks, you know, stay away from magnets or something, there wasn't much more to do with them at the time. So basically, that's the kind of IT that doesn't really matter in today's world. And the role, I think, of IT should really no longer be to provide kind of the direct products and services to fulfill users' needs and desires. It's really to facilitate access to those products and services to fulfill those needs and desires. I'm just going to skip the rest of that. And basically, in facilitating access to services, you know, IT from an institutional standpoint, you know, should, I think, really be focusing on identities and data, because you know, because the institution probably doesn't really care if somebody writes a paper using, you know, some IT-provided computer with you know, we install Microsoft Office obviously by default on all computers, or if somebody goes out and uses Google Docs. You know, generally, I think, you know, institutions would probably care more about the fact that some person at the institution wrote some paper and that it was published, you know, somewhere. And of course, it's generated data, which is the paper in this case, rather than the exact service used in writing that paper. And so basically, those two resources, which used to be just user accounts and bits on a floppy disk, are kind of, I believe, kind of the biggest assets that a university has in today's kind of digital environment. And so you know, we should be kind of and so IT institutions as a whole can serve an important role in the provisioning of identities and management of data. So just to wrap up quickly here, you know, I think kind of to move forward technology-wise in an educational technology, you know, there has to be, from the kind of IT standpoint, there has to be less focus on the actual services, and we have to take control of our identities and data as a persistent, long-lasting, kind of important resources. And that connecting online learning isn't just a matter of stringing together a whole bunch of different services together, but it's kind of the flow of identities and data between them, where context is defined and information is derived and knowledge and value is built. So that's that. Thanks. Yes, question.
I would just say that I understand what you're saying, that open source doesn't matter, but I think the fundamental drivers of open source development and proprietary closed source software then determine what the data is going to be used for, how available it is to the person that generated it. So I would much rather share my information with Identica than Twitter, or like who owns the data that I put on Facebook. And I think that those companies that are venture capital funded and are out to capitalize their investment fundamentally have a different view of what you're speaking about. So I think it does matter.
Sure, I agree.
I would add to that one of the promises that open source software tend to make to their users is that it will continue to exist after the company that created it no longer does, and its code will be accessible by its users. So if you were really in a spot and the company pulled it, you would be able to continue to use it and continue to develop it, or just get your stuff out.
Yeah. I think one of the points I'm trying to make, relate to that, is that the whole idea is to not depend on the software, actually. So that if open source software allowed you to get back your data eventually, so you can take it somewhere else, then that's kind of the key point there. Yeah.
So really, what you term data, and when you use the software, you're leaving out the one about format. So really, what we're concerned about to mitigate the risk is what formats do we use, and are those formats sustainable? And how far do you take that question? Because the internet is an application. So if I only leave it as digital and online, then the risk of the internet going down as much as Twitter going down could be, I don't know, I want to let off a bomb and just blow it a whole lot up. And then get back to microfilm, because it's a far better format.
Yeah, high resolution, yeah.
It's true. Like, I really enjoy the process of writing a blog to print a book. I really enjoy it, and I know the book is going to be there, and I don't even know if the internet's going to be there. The way Facebook's going, I think the internet's not going to be anything I want to use in the next 5 years or so. So I've got the book, at least, of what I wrote, and hopefully all you guys will produce a book, and I'll buy it and put it on my shelf, and there's my internet.
Yeah, so the issue of format is interesting, because actually I get asked that quite a bit internally when I raise this idea, and my response to that is, well, I mean, in the past, it's always about, oh, if we all agree to the same standards and an open standard and so forth, then format issues would magically disappear. But lately, my experience is that I don't think it's a big deal, because of the nature of how kind of web applications do work these days, and that the formats they do use, even if they're proprietary, tend to be, from a technical standpoint, from my standpoint, relatively easy to understand. That even though it's not standard and it's not something I've seen before, I could relatively easily decipher what it meant. So yeah, I mean, that's not a perfect answer, but I think it's less of an issue than it was in the past. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like if everything's in JSON or XML, we can reasonably decipher what that stuff meant. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
So does it mean that IT doesn't have? So if you want to be software, sustainable, but we've got software that enables the formats to be sustainable. So perhaps IT doesn't matter anymore. I find it quite liberating. I don't have to talk to those guys.
Yeah, this is starting to hurt my feelings. As an administrator.
Okay, as usual, anything I do is running late. We're 5 minutes beyond, I believe. I want to ask you all to give Darcy and King another round of applause.